Hello there, my name's Ms.RedNebula and welcome to Game Dev in Progress Diary number 3. As I pretty much expected, I spent most of the last week finishing up the RPG tutorial that was made by Brackus and Sebastian Legge, and happy to say that I finished off everything that they showed in that one. I'm probably not going to go forward and try to create more things within this tutorial, but there was a lot of really useful information in here. And not to mention that because I was following the tutorials on Sebastian's channel that had to do with modeling, I picked up a few tips and tricks for Blender as well. I'm still fairly new to Blender, so any kind of tips and tricks that I can pick up for it are always going to be useful. The first thing that I did that I actually forgot to mention last week was that the items all have stats attached to them. Right now it's just a very simple armor modifier and a damage modifier. I created a thing called a scriptable object, which allows you to make a type of object within Unity that has customizable, just different variables and things that are attached to it, including all sorts. Like you can have entire lists attached to it, you can have items that have sliders if you need them and stuff, but in this case it is simply a case of here's an armor modifier, here's a damage modifier, what equipment slot does the item fit into. This object in particular is strictly for equipment, but it's kind of got an overarching type of scriptable object just called an item, where I can create things like health potions or any number of different things. Go collect 5 rat whiskers and turn them into this NPC sort of thing. This really did end up reminding me a lot of old school EverQuest, so if there's any EverQuest players out there, hi, I was on Morel Thule. I played a druid and a rogue and an enchanter and a lot of other characters. It really was called Evercrack for a reason. So when I put the enemy into the scene first off and just created it as a simple object, just like we did with the player at first. He's just a big old cube, but he does have an aggro radius that he'll ignore you as long as you're outside of the aggro radius, but as soon as you pass into it, off he goes chasing you, and he will continue to chase you until either he dies or you die. At this point, he actually doesn't do any damage, and I can't do any damage to him, so right now he's just kind of following me around like a lost puppy. The next thing we tackled was over on Sebastian's channel, where he was showing us how to do the modeling for the sword and shield. And I mean, he could have just created, a simple longsword or something like that, but he did a scimitar, which doesn't exactly fit into the world, but I guess it's fantasy, so you can do whatever you want. He showed how to use the curve modifier, which I hadn't really used before, in order to make the curve of the sword very nice and even, rather than sitting there and modeling it bit by bit with every individual vertex. There's a few different ways that I now know how to do stuff like that, but this was just a way that I'd never used before. Similarly, with the shield, we actually started with a NURB surface rather than using polygons to make it, and then converted it over to being a polygon mesh at the end. I hadn't worked with NURBs before, but I am kind of familiar with them. I know that they use curves and mathematics to create three-dimensional objects rather than a normal polygon object, which is made up of vertices and all of the triangles, polygons in between them. Also went on to doing all of the different attack animations. So when the character is just walking and running around, that's one set of animations that we covered before. And when they go to attack something, do they have a sword in their hand? And if so, how does the attack look then? If they don't have a sword in their hand, are they just punching? How do you make that work? So made 3 different attack animations, 2 of which are going to be for when they're carrying a sword, and 1 of which is when they don't have any kind of weapon equipped. And here we've swapped out our enemy model with the lovely box that was probably not the scariest thing in the world for a little skeleton. I did not make this model. This was one that Sebastian just had available for us to plunk in and use, but it's a relatively simple model and wouldn't have been that hard to put together. Also learned how to use an avatar mask so that only a part of the model would change with a certain animation. So in practice, this was used for, like, when you go to equip something like a sword, instead of the hand just being in a rest position, it will actually change to grip the sword. And unequip that, and his hand opens back out again. And just like equipping the armor, we can now equip the sword and the shield as well. The process for doing that was very similar. Most of what was needed, it was stuff that had already been written. It was just a matter of getting the new objects into the scene. So I did try to go ahead and, instead of just watching the process being done by this was Sebastian showing how to integrate these into the scene, I went ahead and tried to do it myself and succeeded. So I hope that means that I learned something. It felt pretty good to be able to do it and then watch him doing it and know that I was following the right procedures. The characters also now have a health bar that turns up just above their head as soon as they start taking any kind of damage, and then disappears after a little while if they haven't taken damage for a few seconds. The way that that works is actually 2 images overlaid on top of one another, with one of them able to have a fill that can be changed via what the program says that is the amount of health that they've currently got. And in-game you can now see the health bars in action. And as you can see, I don't have the sword equipped right now, so I've just got a single punching animation going. If I equip the sword, you can also see that both of the different animations play in a randomized way, and as soon as the enemy loses all his health, he disappears. And you just saw that the health bar disappeared as well as soon as I wasn't taking any damage anymore. That's really about it for this tutorial. It's by far not a finished game or anything even close to a finished game, but there's a lot of really useful concepts that I learned, and I feel a heck of a lot more confident in approaching my own kind of projects for Unity after this. And last but not least, since you stuck around to the end, here's a little sneak preview of the werewolves I've been working on. Alright guys, that's it for this one. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe if you want to follow along, and check out my Patreon for sneak peeks and other perks. Big thank you to my current patrons. That's all for now. Bye! Mathematics and curves to create 3D objects rather than polygons, which just use a bunch of vertices and the... Cat, shut up!